Welcome to the Successful Nonprofits Podcast. I'm your host, Dolph Goldenberg. And in today's episode, friend, we are going to be talking about virtual or remote volunteering with Michele Wiesner. So if you've ever felt like you're missing out on the hidden potential of remote volunteers because you don't have a remote volunteer program, that's right, not just one or two volunteers, you're like, oh yeah, I'll dial it in, but like an actual program for remote volunteers, well, this episode with Michele Wiesner is going to be a game changer for you. Michele is a nonprofit leader dedicated to improving teams, programs, and organizations every day. She is passionate about meaningful collaboration between individuals and organizations. We're talking about collaborations that move missions forward and create more impact in the communities that they serve. Michele serves as the Director of Capacity Building at Hire Heroes USA, an organization that is committed to empowering U.S. military members, veterans, and military spouses to succeed in the civilian workforce. Michele has a wealth of experience in volunteer engagement, and I have to share with you, she is a strong advocate for recognizing that volunteer management is a professional field. While at Hire Heroes USA, she has built an effective remote volunteer program, and she has built it from the ground up. And in doing so, Michele demonstrated the impact that volunteers who are working remotely can have, and that you don't always have to have people come in person to your site or to someone else's site. Hey, Michele, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Dolph. I'm happy to be here.
Now, I know you and I spoke, I think sometime last week about how you all realized you needed to begin a virtual volunteer program. But if we could maybe start there and kind of move forward from there.
Sure. So I joined Hire Heroes USA back in 2012. The organization was quite a bit smaller, and the organization recognized the need that they needed a volunteer program, period. There was no volunteer program in existence at all. And so it was a great opportunity to hire somebody. Fortunately, I was hired to be the organization's first volunteer coordinator. And the challenge presented to me was create a volunteer program that has meaningful opportunities for volunteers so they feel like they're giving their time in constructive, impactful ways, but also meets a need that we have within the organization. And so I didn't really start out with the intent of creating a virtual volunteer program, but because our service delivery model dealt with clients, military veterans, and military spouses virtually, it made sense to craft a volunteer program that mimicked that same service delivery model so that it would be sustainable and we weren't creating opportunities that would be, just busy work for volunteers looking to give time.
Part of what I'm so fascinated by is this is years before the pandemic. Like we all, at some point in 2020, we're like, maybe we can do more things virtually. But this is years and years before that.
Yeah, that's right. So this was back in 2012. And I should say that the field of virtual volunteering has been in existence way before that even. So I need to credit Jane Cravens and Susan J. Ellis. These are founders in the field of volunteer engagement and in virtual volunteering specifically, that there have been opportunities for volunteers to give back to organizations in virtual ways by using online tools and the like for decades now. It's just since the pandemic, as you alluded to, more organizations had to make that hard pivot because we were shut down, because we weren't able to accept people in person and have those same in-person opportunities that most organizations had. So there was this hard pivot during COVID. And I think for some organizations that sort of opened the aperture for them a little bit, they've recognized that, okay, maybe there is a place for virtual volunteering. But then for some organizations, they've even kind of turned back now that there's a little more normalcy, I guess, now with COVID, that there are in-person opportunities opening back up. And so they've pivoted away from that virtual volunteering component again. So for some organizations, it was a full integration, it was a full acceptance. And then for others, it's not. And that's really just based on the individual organization, their mission, and the culture that they're looking to create for volunteers.
And I'll also say, I think there are a lot of organizations that during those early years of the pandemic kind of put their volunteer program on ice. They said, if people can't be in person, we can't figure out how to do this virtually or remotely. So hopefully people are going to come back.
Right, exactly, exactly. And I think the big message I would have for people who do have that kind of attitude, or who maybe feel daunted by the prospect of integrating volunteers into their missions and programs virtually, is that it's really not that different what we're talking about. That basically all of the best practices that apply to volunteer engagement, making sure you have a meaningful recruiting cycle, you're recognizing people, you're onboarding them in thoughtful ways, you're giving them resources and tools to succeed, you're trying to engage them and retain them for the long term. All of that still applies, whether they're giving in person or whether they're giving virtually. And for some volunteers, it's an accessibility issue. They maybe don't have the time or capacity or capability even to come in person to give 8 hours to a shift or a half day to a shift. So for some people, virtual volunteering is all they can manage to fit in with their busy schedules and with all of their other commitments. So I really like to encourage nonprofit professionals and leaders of volunteers to think about how could you be broadening the pool of volunteers for your organization if you added a virtual volunteer component.
And I might even go a step further and say, clearly it broadens the pool, but not just the pool of folks who are outside of your region. And so, for example, I live in Metro Atlanta, and at rush hour to get from one end of Metro Atlanta to the other could take 2 or 2.5 hours. So if there's an organization that's at the top end perimeter, Friends, the perimeter is like our loop highway, what they call the Beltway in DC. But it's like if you're at the top end perimeter and the organization you want to go volunteer at's at the bottom end perimeter, you're not going to do a 2-hour shift after work because it's going to take you 90 minutes to 2 hours to get there. It's going to take you an hour to get home. So all in, that becomes a 5-hour shift.
Yeah, it's a barrier, right? It's a barrier to entry. And I've absolutely heard people make decisions, not necessarily on volunteering, but whether they were going to attend in-person events, whether the event was ITP or OTP, for those who are familiar with the Atlanta lingo. So inside the perimeter, outside the perimeter. So yeah, absolutely. It can be a barrier. And there are other barriers that exist as well. And certainly want to acknowledge that with virtual volunteering, a part of the component is access to the internet and access to a computer. And so that can be a barrier as well. So do want to acknowledge that it's not that virtual volunteering comes with zero barriers. There are still, factors to consider about what your volunteers can bring to the table. But I would say it's, something to consider as you're looking at, a broad and inclusive volunteer program.
Now, you and Hire Heroes USA have been doing this for about a dozen years now. Can you share a success story of a remote volunteer that maybe made a significant impact on a person?
Sure. I'd love to tell a story from one of my longtime volunteers. She's been with us for almost 10 years now. This will be her 10th year anniversary in 2024. And early on, she was mentoring one of our military veteran clients. And so the majority of volunteer opportunities that we have center on mentoring. So professionals from a variety of fields and industries and companies can share their expertise and knowledge with a military veteran or military spouse who is separating and maybe wanting to break into a new industry or perhaps make a career pivot or maybe just expand that experience that they've gained in the military. So this volunteer, forget how long it was into her service with us, but she got approached for a mentoring opportunity with a military veteran client, and he had been out for about 9 months. So approaching a year, he had a great resume, he had fantastic experience, but he was getting stuck at that first interview. And it wasn't really clear why, because again, he had great experience, he had a fantastic resume. And so my volunteer looking at this just contextual information thought, okay, there must be something going on in that interview that's just knocking him out of the round, right? That it's happening over and over. So she accepted the opportunity, and she was a little bit nervous going into it. She had 30 plus years of HR experience, so she had the background to help him and help him well, but it was going to be a phone connection, mentorship conversation, and she wasn't sure that she would be able to establish that rapport and make the connection with him him that she would be able to see that light bulb moment, if you will, because they were going to be on the phone. They weren't in the same room. So she was carrying that into the conversation, being a little bit nervous about it. But, she moves forward, has the conversation with him. And within the first couple of minutes on the phone, she could tell, like, just his tone of voice, the energy with which he was answering questions. He was clearly down. And it was a light bulb moment for her to say, all right, well, if this is the energy he's bringing into an interview, then obviously this is why he's not advancing, right? He's just really down and out. He's lost his confidence, and he's not selling himself in an interview, which is obviously what you need to do in order to advance and ultimately get a job. So a couple questions in, it's not going well. He's, that same tone of voice, that same lack of confidence. So she decides to pivot. She puts the conversation on hold and she says, you know what, let's try something different. So she really quickly emails him the list of questions that she had prepared to ask him as the mock interviewer, send them to him and say, hey, let's turn the tables. Let's do a role reversal. You ask the questions and I will be the interviewee. So they did that. He was up for the change. And so he started asking her questions. She answered one, and then they would immediately do a debrief. So she was putting into practice the things that she was looking for in the interview. So it was a really great teaching moment. And within, I think it was 2 or 3 questions that they got through, she heard that light bulb moment over the phone. He said, oh, I see what you're saying. I see how you're painting this picture. And they could actually finish the rest of the mock interview with him answering the questions as the interviewee, and she went back to the role of interviewer. So it was a really fantastic opportunity, and he ended up getting a job shortly thereafter. And this was years ago at this point, but it was just such a great indication of he needed just a little push. This was probably less than an hour that she invested, but it made such a difference for him, right? And she could have this big light bulb moment for him as the candidate, for her as the volunteer, that look, I can make an impact, and I didn't have to go anywhere. I didn't have to be face to face. And I would posit that part of the power of this story is that this connection wouldn't necessarily have been made even if it wasn't a virtual volunteer opportunity, because they weren't co-located, right? They weren't in the same city. They probably weren't even in the same state. But because we match based on industry experience and some of those things, the personalized matching that we do, they could have this really meaningful conversation over the phone. And it ended up being a success story for both of them, I think.
It's funny, Michelle, I was just about to challenge you and say, wait, why would this not have happened in person? And then I'm like, oh, got it. They are nowhere even close to each other. So I love that. I really, really love that. So what advice would you give to nonprofit leaders that are looking to start their own remote volunteer program?
I would say start small. I always like to say, start with that to-do list that's just not getting done, right? We all have that list, right? We all have that list of things that, oh, it would be nice if, or one day when I have all that free time, which never happens, right? Look at that list. And is there something on that list that a volunteer could help you with, or a volunteer could help you with remotely? So is there, data cleanup that could be done? Is there research that could be done that a volunteer could be doing remotely for you or online for you? I think there are lots of opportunities if we just take the time to reflect and see where that low-hanging fruit might exist, but try to find small wins like that and then build on it over time, because it can be daunting when you're changing the way you're doing a program. It can be daunting if you're trying to win over, your colleagues who are having to work with volunteers as well. So that can be a whole nother hurdle that you have to jump through. So try to demonstrate some small wins and then build on that success over time, and then acknowledge what you're learning along the way. Every opportunity, everything you try may not be a 100% win, but there's probably an opportunity to learn and improve off of it.
So I know one of the things that you are a huge advocate for is that volunteer management is a profession. So I want to ask you some questions now around virtual volunteering and how a volunteer management professional would handle some things. And so, for example, does onboarding look different when it's virtual versus in person?
That's a great question. So it does look different from a pure application standpoint, the practice of it. So in-person volunteer onboarding might be the person physically coming into an office. You're meeting them face to face. There's probably an opportunity to give them, snacks and some, we love food. So snacks and treats like that to recognize them for their hard work. There's a certain amount of vetting, right, that you can do in person with someone that you may not be able to do to the same degree if it's virtual. But the same types of things you're going to be looking to do virtually as well. So you're still going to be looking to do vetting to some degree. You're still going to look for that reliability of a volunteer. They're going to show up when they say they're going to show up. You're going to hold them accountable. You want to make sure that they are equipped with the information and the resources that they need to do the job that you're asking them to do, to be a powerful advocate for your organization. So all of that still applies. It's just the modality with which you're delivering it changes a little bit.
Can we talk about the pros and cons of, for example, a live virtual cohort versus videos versus maybe a live one-on-one onboarding?
Yeah. So you're asking me to talk about the differences between those?
Yeah. And to be clear, I think you're not going to probably talk about it together. I'm just really curious, like your thoughts, because I mean, I can see where there's advantages and disadvantages for each of those.
Mm-hmm. It can really depend on the role, I think. So what are you asking the volunteer to do? Are they going to be volunteering themselves in an individual versus a group or cohort capacity? Because then there's absolutely advantages to bringing people together and training them together, making sure their understanding is the same, building that sense of community, if you will, building that together from the very start, from the very get-go. But for our program, for example, all of the onboarding is done individually and most of the volunteering is done individually as well, so that it's a common experience, I guess I should say. Their commonalities for the volunteer, what they get on day one is the same thing they get at day 101 as they're volunteering with us. And there's some efficiency gains that can happen there, right? So for us, for example, there's an online portion of the orientation, a self-paced portion, so that a volunteer can complete some standard understanding and standard education and training that can happen online on their own. They can do it as they have time. And then we conduct an interview with them individually to try and get to know them a little bit more and make sure that we have the information that we need to do that personalized matching that takes place for our mentoring program. So it's a blend, if you will. So it really, in my mind, it depends on what you're asking the volunteer to do, but there can absolutely be benefits to all different formats.
And so that self-paced program that you've got online, I assume it's multiple sessions or multiple parts of a curriculum. Are there assessments that are attached to that or no?
Oh, that's a good question. So there is a little quiz that we have at the end to test for understanding, but it's low stakes is what I would call it. It's not an official assessment or anything, and most of the assessing, I would say, really takes place during that onboarding interview that we conduct at the end of a training session to make sure that the person doesn't have any questions and to verify, you learned this in the training. Do you have any questions about that? Do you have any issues with that? And then, of course, there are opportunities as an individual starts volunteering with us if we find that maybe there's some I don't want to say mistakes, but there are some practices happening that may not be in allegiance to our policies. That's an opportunity for us to come in and say, this is what was covered during the training. Do you have any questions about that? Can we refresh this? Point to our handbook policy, that kind of thing.
So you literally just segued to the next thing I wanted to talk about, which was volunteer management. What does that look like, and how is it different when it's virtual?
I feel like I'm a repeating an old record here, but best practices, they're the same, right? You do want to make sure you're getting standards in place. You're setting those expectations from day one that this is what a volunteer is expected to do as part of our organization. Here are the standards they're expected to uphold. Here are our policies. Here's the structure and infrastructure that's set up to make sure that you can succeed as a volunteer. We want to set all of that up for success, both for us as the organization and then win for you as the volunteer. Because if volunteers don't have a great experience, they're not going to come back, right? And we do want to retain volunteers. So all of the best practices that you know about with volunteering. So making sure you have got a handbook with policies, that you're updating that on a regular basis, that you're communicating well with your volunteers, that they know what to expect, they know what's expected of them, that you're recognizing your volunteers and thanking them on a very regular basis, preferably every single time you're interacting with them. All of that is part of engaging a volunteer virtually. And there are some components that become even more important because you're not able to build the same rapport that you do with an in-person volunteer. So I'm not going to run into my volunteers in the break room, right? Or in the parking lot and just chit chat with them about their weekend or their kids or their dog. I'm not going to be able to establish some of those, you know, things that you don't plan for that are important to building those relationships. So you've got to figure out other ways to build relationships with volunteers, and then also acknowledging that for some people it can be, I don't want to say a transactional experience, but I think for some of our volunteers, they're working professionals. They're not trying to spend a hours and hours and hours volunteering. But they want to know that when they're giving time, that it's being spent well, that it's impactful for both them and for the client that they're serving, for the organization that they're serving. And so it's our job as staff members to make sure that we're executing that as well as we can.
So this is a good place for me to ask the question. And I'd be willing to bet that I'm asking this question probably on behalf of 500 or 1,000 people. I'd be willing to bet. So I feel confident maybe there's some people who've downloaded this who are thinking to themselves, I have a budget that's under $500,000. And I feel like I run from fire to fire. How could I possibly find the time to put together a virtual volunteer program? So for that smaller organization, and I know Hire Heroes USA is a significantly larger organization than that. So for that smaller organization with very limited resources, what would you recommend to them as some small steps they could take to move in the direction of utilizing remote and virtual volunteers?
Yeah, similar answer as before in terms of finding those small wins. And Hire Heroes USA is a fairly large organization now in the world of nonprofits, but we weren't always. And when we started our volunteer program back in 2012, we're talking about a couple dozen volunteers for that whole year, and now we've got 1,500 nationally. So, and thousands of volunteer hours. So it's definitely grown over that time, but you have to start somewhere. And for a small organization, I would again look for kind of that crossroads, if you will, of where in your priority list are there things that you would really love to get done, but you just find that you don't have the time. It's just not happening despite your best efforts. And then where do you have a pool of people who are strong advocates for you? And are you approaching those advocates for things already? And that could maybe turn into a regular volunteer opportunity. So I'm just making things up now, but do you have a regular group of supporters that you go to, hey, can you blast this out to your network? We have an event and we'd love for you to share it because we want to get good participation. Are there people or a person, again, like set your goal pretty small. Is there a person that you know of who you think believes in your mission enough that they would be willing to dedicate 30 minutes? I mean, again, set your goal real small. You don't need to create something that's like hours and hours and hours, but just a small little bite-sized chunk where it makes it easier for the volunteer to say yes, and it makes it easier for you as the staff member to say, yeah, I can come up with something that you can do for 30 minutes. But, I do want to focus in on that a little bit, that go to what you already need doing. Don't try to create don't try to create anything, but certainly don't try to create a volunteer program or virtual volunteer opportunities just to say we have virtual volunteer opportunities. No, no. This is about solving an existing problem that you already have. And I'm sure you have them, right? Because as a small organization, they're all you are wearing so many hats. It's really hard. You're doing such a good job out there. I just want to be your cheerleader too. Like you're doing important work. And you have people who really believe in you and they believe in the work of your organization. So is there one person in your network that you could integrate into your organization a little bit differently? And could they be doing that work online? Could they be doing that work via email or via phone instead of coming into your office or coming into your headquarters? There's probably a yes answer to that. So I don't know if that answered your question, Dolph, but that's probably how I would try to approach it.
So, Michele, you saw me smiling from ear to ear. That should be the tagline for all of us. Don't solve a new problem that is not your problem. Solve an existing problem that you need to figure out. I like that a lot. And to use virtual volunteers for that. Thank you. And Michele, this is probably a good place for us to lay this part of the conversation down and move over to two truths and a lie. So we've all played two truths and a lie at some point. So if you would please share three quote unquote facts about yourself. Two of them will be true. One of them will be a lie. And I will get to try to guess which one is incorrect.
Okay. I want to let you know that I feel like I've been very gracious in this because I've listened to past episodes and I feel like I know that your weaknesses are like sports and just you've got like some key areas where you're like, I don't know anything about this. And I love your authenticity whenever you you try to play this game. But okay. All right. So my three facts are I'm the first person in my family born in the United States. I have been skydiving before, and I have not traveled overseas before.
Oh, these are hard. Okay, so first person in your family, born in the United States, you have been skydiving before, and you've not traveled overseas. Okay, I need to ask a refining question because yes, this happened recently where someone said I did XYZ at 22 and I guessed that it was true and they said no, I was 18 when I did it. So I need to ask a refining question. When you say overseas, do you mean outside the borders of the United States or do you mean actually over an ocean?
I meant over an ocean when I wrote it.
Okay, sorry, just wanted to make sure I understood that. Okay. I am going to guess. So, I always like to start with what I think is true. I like the process of elimination, even though apparently that process does not work well for me a lot. So I believe that you have been skydiving. And I believe that you are the first person in your family born in the United States. So, and I think by your face, I got it wrong already. But so I'm going to guess that the thing that is not true is that you have indeed been overseas.
Right. Yeah, you got it right. So you won.
No way. Oh my gosh. I know.
I'm smiling from ear to ear because I'm like, Dolph got one. I'm so happy. I'm so happy for you.
Wow. I know. And I'll share with you, when I saw your face, I was like, oh, that smile. I just lost. I know I just lost. So wow, I can't believe that. I feel like I just won the two truths and a lie lottery. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Academy. The Tonys were on last night. No, 2 nights ago. I did not watch them, but so I'd like to thank the Academy. So
there you go. Yeah.
Michele, thank you so much for coming on and having this conversation about virtual volunteering. As I mentioned at the top of the episode, I really do think there are lots of ways we could be using virtual volunteers, and we're not. And if we could just find, as you said, if we could think about ways we could solve some current problems by finding a volunteer who may or may not be in our region, that could be incredibly useful. So thank you so much. And I also want to make sure that our friends who are listening know how to find you. So the first thing, friends, you can go to Hire Heroes USA website. That is hireheroesusa.org. And when you're at that site, you're going to see how you can get involved through volunteering or donating. And let me share just a quick secret shopper secret with you. If you're interested in virtual volunteering, definitely go to the volunteer sections of their webpage. See how they're talking about it. This is also just a really good opportunity to get some information. Additionally, also at the top of the show, I mentioned that Michele is such an advocate for volunteer management and it being her profession. And so when we asked Michele what URLs we should be promoting, Michelle's like, oh, the Georgia Association for Volunteer Administration. And you can find that at mygava.org. And that is for leaders of volunteers. So if you are a volunteer manager, a volunteer coordinator, if you are growing a community of volunteers, this is a great organization for you. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, I'm not in Georgia. Okay. You might not be in Georgia, but if you're in the United States, I'd be willing to bet there's some kind of a statewide association for volunteer administration in your state. So make sure you check that out as well. And then lastly, we're going to link to Michele's LinkedIn profile. Hey, Michele, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you so much, Dolph. This has been great. And I just want to thank all of your listeners. I know that they're doing such great work, and don't be intimidated by the virtual volunteering. You can do it. It's totally fine.
Thank you. And friends, if you liked this episode, if it got you scratching your head thinking, maybe there's some different ways that we could be engaging volunteers where we get more volunteers and frankly could get more of our problems solved. Because again, this is about how do we solve our problems? Well, if you found this episode useful, there's two more I want you to think about. They're almost 50 episodes apart. One is episode 297, Volunteer Fundraisers Unleashed with Maura McDaniel. If you do not recall that episode, she is someone who had never asked for $1 before in her life, not a professional fundraiser, and agreed to lead up sponsorships for an event and actually broke all of this event's fundraising records. The most they'd ever raised, I'm doing this off the top of my head, I think it was like $70,000, $80,000, $90,000. She brought in over twice that. Yeah, having never asked for money before. So when I saw Maura do that, I literally was like, Maura, we got to get you on the podcast because every executive director, every development director, every volunteer manager I know says, if only I could get my volunteers to fundraise. Well, Maura talks about how you can get them to fundraise. The next is episode 242, Make Volunteering Fun with Diane Zhang. And you can also get that episode as well as Maura McDaniel's episode in the show notes. You might remember we're now including that actually in the notes on your phone. So just open up your phone, scroll down, and you can click on either episode. That, my friends, is our show for the week. I hope that you have gained some insight to help you and your nonprofit thrive. And believe it or not, I have to do this every week, and I don't want to do it. The lawyers require that I do it. And by the way, if you are hanging out and listening to this, oh my gosh, I love you. You're one of those amazing human beings who actually goes all the way to the very end of a podcast. But here goes. This podcast is for informational purposes only. And you know what that means, right? It means it should not be relied on for tax, legal, or accounting advice. Please, if that is what you need. And I think I say this probably every episode, do not try to get that from a podcast. Do not try to get this from Google either, by the way, or even worse, from ChatGPT. Please don't get it from there. What I need you to do, if you need tax, legal, or accounting advice, find a licensed, qualified professional in your area and get the counsel you need. And if you're not sure either what type of professional you should be talking to, or if there's someone in your area, you can reach out to me, and I'm happy to help you figure that piece out.